So I've talked in the past about how the point we're at as a species right now is basically our old system of control. It's basically the macro ego. If you want to think about we have an individual ego and then a larger social ego, or a macro ego as a species that is, or maybe a collective ego is a better way of thinking about it. And I've, what's happened is that has come under attack, and it's had to defend itself, and it senses that its end is near. And so we got what we got in the past year, which, viewed from that perspective, is not all that surprising. And the ego, by its nature, separates and divides, and it tries to perpetuate that. It keeps people fighting, keeps the mind fighting itself. It keeps people in a state of lack, or a state of not having enough. And that's pretty much how it works. So if you want to keep people separated and divided, you might mandate that people be physically separated from each other. They need to stay apart and not communicate, not love, not build relationships, because that's how the game works. So we are at a point where we are about as far away from each other, just on average, than we've ever been before. We are legally mandated in many instances to be separated 6 feet apart from each other, not socialize and not do all those things. And you can say that it's about a virus, and you can say it's under the guise of public health and safety and all that, but it's much more subtle than that. This is a very obvious fight for control and power for an old system that senses its own end. And it's been fairly effective in a lot of ways, very sad in a lot of ways, for a variety of reasons. And it's difficult to maintain a sense of love or connection, or and all that during this time, especially from a meditation standpoint. Yes, it is something that you can do on your own, or you absolutely can do on your own, but it's also helpful to be around other people and to have that sort of spiritual community or environment of people supporting one another and feeling that they're not alone in going through this process. So yeah, that's been the difficulty of the past, of this whole transformation that we seem to be still going through, on a worldwide basis. And that varies depending on where you live, obviously, what circumstances you're in, but the trend is kind of the same. So, on the opposite end of that, and what that macro ego is trying to protect against, is the universal love or awareness or consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, that meditation leads to, the enlightenment. And as I've said, that process is, and as you've probably read elsewhere, is primarily learning to become a witness, or an observer of our own mind and our sense experience or our emotional experience, our thought processes, and simply refusing to engage that process, which you can do silently on your own, just sitting comfortably and watching this unfold. And I've gone over the scientific explanation or research behind this in other videos or in my book, which is fairly straightforward regarding the default mode network and all that. And so the transformation that comes about is, beginning from the perspective of an individual, a separate ego, a separate self that is, relatively afraid and lacking or anxious or depressed. These kind of come with the territory, and they are perpetuated by a conditioning and a programming from a world that thrives off of that, an animal world that we're sort of evolving out of. And so when you start to watch that process, as opposed to identifying with the particular forms of thought or emotion or whatever it is that comes up during this process, the transition goes from being a separate self that is lacking and limited and constrained by all sorts of variables, and gradually shifts into just a universal consciousness or universal witness. Because the famous sort of inquiry question of who am I, what is the I? And that is the observer of meditation that sees, that watches the thoughts and emotions come and go as you sit for, preferably half hour or an hour, or whatever you can do during that process of meditation, which has varying instructions to it. But I go over that on the website if you need a recap of how to do it. So that process turns into sort of a revealing of the eternal presence of what we truly are, which is infinite and undivided, and you could call it love or God or whatever. And that's, it all sounds nice theoretically, but the purpose of meditation is to experientially become that, or stop becoming the small little afraid person that is dependent and anxious all the time. And so that is what happens. That is the result of the who am I question, or the neti process of meditation, is slowly removing the identifications and the addictions and the pull that takes us into separation and lack. And what you've come to find is that the witness or the observer or the I'll just stick with those two, but the witness or the observer that is seeing the personality of the ego of the individual, Jeff or whatever your name is, that thinks it's that person, that observer is universal. It's the same for me, it's the same for you. It's the one substrate for all of creation that is in plants, air, whatever you want to single out as being a thing. It is actually nothing, or the same one thing expressing through infinite forms. So what you and I are at our core is exactly the same thing. It's indefinite, it's infinite, it has no death or birth or any limitations whatsoever. The form comes and goes, it is born and dies, and it transforms into a million different things that we can get lost into. But the formless remains always. It never starts, it never finishes. It's just there. It's non-dimensional. It's has no duration of time. And because we've become so continuously conditioned and identified with one particular form, name, story, whatever, we've forgotten that. We've tricked ourselves into being something that, or thinking that we are something that we really aren't. And, it's a fun game to play. It has its drama and its intrigue and all that. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's not a judgment of that process. We have to go through that as part of this sort of evolutionary cycle. But if we want to grow up from that or mature out of that situation with all of its limitations and problems, which it seems apparently that we do to some degree on a macro scale, then this is the way out. The meditation, psychedelics, there's many different methods towards getting out of the mind or detaching from this thing. Obviously, I prefer mine, and that's the way that I teach, because I think it's the most direct method. It's not anything new. It's the same stuff that's been around for thousands of years. But that is, the heart of the matter is seeing the error in what we're doing and allowing ourselves to drop out of this old way of doing things that hasn't been particularly helpful, especially as we're coming towards the end of this timeline of the ego. It's apparent, pretty obvious to see the damage that this separation and division is doing to us on an individual and social basis, just politically or economically and all that, and just our own health. So yeah, that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about today, just as far as the process of becoming the observer and letting our old self die in the fire of meditation. That's what this whole thing is about, really. So yeah, we're still in this transformational period of things being sorted out, on a larger scale. And it's, as I said before in the previous video, I think it's going to take a little time before we can clear out and get close to one another again, or perhaps it will continually split apart, and there'll be kind of two worlds where you can be connected. You can stay in a state of fear or the COVID new normal world if you want to do that, and you can move into something a bit more connected and positive. Side by side, it kind of remains to be seen how that works itself out on a political scale, but we'll see what happens there. And as I said, I'm trying to make some headway into that myself as far as setting up a physical location for doing this. And if you want to be part of that at all, or you have any feedback, drop me a message and I'll be glad to get in touch with you regarding that. I'm looking probably just to start with a smaller office space and just sort of do weekly meditations at this point. And we'll see what develops as far as COVID and reopening even more, and where it goes from there. All right, see you guys.